Good morning or good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining our second day of NENA's Narratives Week, how stories can change our world, and in our particular area of interest, how can stories change our economy? Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work and play here on the beautiful lands of the Yagara Turrbal people in North Brisbane. I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the remarkable civilizational culture and governance system that has cared for country and cared for each other since time immemorial. I'd also like to acknowledge any Indigenous people joining us in our discussions today. And as I often do, the work that we do inside the New Economy Network Australia and in my other organisations like the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, we like to acknowledge the ongoing impacts and legacy of colonisation and recognise that one of the 5 core principles of NENA's work is recognising Indigenous sovereignty and First Nations people's own objectives within this beautiful continent. That's usually the slide I have when I'm acknowledging country. Isn't it beautiful? May I invite you all to take a moment, take a big deep breath and have a think about where you live, whose country you live on and who you live with. It could be the blue-banded bees like I have in my garden and many, many species of birds and possums. Only last night I was awoken to the sound of galloping, gigantic hippopotamus-sized possums tip-tapping over my roof and having a good time. And even inside the work of a new economy network like NENA, the core goal of what we're up to in NENA is how do we shift and rethink what we say about the economy, what we think about the economy and what we think the economy is all about so that we can care for the beautiful plants, animals and human beings who will live here on this continent together. So do take a moment and as we always invite folks, drop in the chat where you're from, whose country you're on, have a think about your favorite animal. That's always nice to know. It just makes you happy to think about the good things in life. And I guess I'll also encourage you all, as I've just mentioned, to pop in the chat where you are, whose country you're on, remembering that this amazing continent continues to be the home for one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth. And our Indigenous hub inside NENA, which is people like Ross Williams and Mary Graham as part of it, are working with us in an ongoing way to make sure that we respect country and people and culture. So NENA Narratives Week, apologies to anyone who heard some of what I'm going to say yesterday when we opened our wonderful webinar. Here inside the New Economy Network Australia, we're really excited about the idea of all of the component parts of rethinking and reconstructing and transforming the economic system so that it serves people and planet. I'm delighted to introduce Chris Riedy, my co-conspirator in leading the NENA Narratives Hub. I'm going to hand over the discussions and the formatting to Chris shortly, and he can say hello to you. The NENA Narratives Hub was created as one of many hubs inside our beautiful distributed governance system inside NENA, and we're really interested in how we tell the kinds of stories that influence our thinking and our actions in a society, and how do we change or build on some of those stories to move away from extractivism and ideas of elite created wealth and move more towards the kind of world we want to build. What's the role of stories? What are stories? And how do we fiddle with them and embed them differently into our culture? These are all the kinds of questions that we ponder in the NENA Narratives Hub. And I'd like to acknowledge anyone else on the call today who's part of our hub. We've had some very vibrant discussions leading up to this week. Now, this week, so many things happening. If you've already registered, that's terrific. You've probably seen the program. Yesterday, we had an excellent session where we had Chris Riedy and Alana Marsh and a recording from the lovely Catherine Trebek talking about why narratives matter and how a story is important in a culture. Today, we're talking all about how do we communicate an inspiring, succinct and memorable vision for our future. And I'll let Chris introduce our fantastic speakers today. Tomorrow, Wednesday, we've nicknamed it our NENA Gruen panel. We're going to be looking further into stories And we had the grand idea that one way to pick apart old stories is if we play with some of the visual images and stories we hear, certain elements inside what we would call the old economy, particularly the fossil fuel economy, and have a look at the stories they tell themselves and our others, and then pick that apart and also do the same to what we see as an emerging new story around regenerative everything. So tomorrow should be fun, and we're going to have some interactive exercises with anyone who can join us. On Thursday, we're really pleased because a couple of folks inside the NENA Narratives Hub, like Fiona Brooks, will be working with others like Johanna de Ruta. I hope I spelled her name right, said her name right. It's an evening session, not a lunchtime session. People need people, a warm data session. And then on Friday, after building all these ideas and exploring today with our beautiful speakers, and Friday is going to be all about a workshop that helps us think about how we all become storytellers and what does that look like when we connect it to our interests in changing the economy. So that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Chris in a moment, but today's webinar is all about how do we communicate an inspiring, succinct and memorable vision for the future of society, Australian and otherwise. Over to you, Chris. I think you're there, but are you muted?
I was having all sorts of trouble with the mute button.
It's all right. I'm having all sorts of trouble getting myself off-pinned. Yes.
I've been using Zoom for years. So thanks, Michelle, and welcome everybody. And yes, we had a lovely session yesterday, which really looked at the power of narratives in why they're important for NENA, and I guess started to look at the currently dominant narratives, the narratives of neoliberal capitalism. Today is really looking beyond where we are to a vision of what could be. And my role today is really just to introduce our fabulous speakers. So first up, we're going to hear from Elena Siegfried. Elena is an author, storyteller, narrative strategist, social innovator, systems change advocate, and spoken word artist based in Wellington, New Zealand. She's dedicated to helping businesses, organisations and individuals to connect authentically and find collective solutions to systemic problems through story. And she wrote a wonderful book called A Future Untold, which I picked up last year and thoroughly enjoyed. It was the kind of book where you go, gosh, I wish I'd written that myself. That is just lovely. And for those who were here yesterday, I quoted from the book in my opening presentation, but was really particularly taken by Elena's 10 new myths, some of them also being old myths for humanity, and really was a great way of synthesizing where we might be heading with narratives, what might be the kind of things that we really want to hold on to as we weave new narratives together. So I'm going to hand over to Alina. I will, our other guests today are Caresse, Cranwell and Sophia van Ruth from Wicked Elephants. I'll give them a more fulsome introduction after we've had the time with Alina. So Alina, I'm going to hand over to you now. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. Kia ora, Chris. Thank you for that lovely welcome. And I'll introduce myself properly in a minute, but just to say, very excited to be here and see a few faces and names that I recognise on the participant list, and excited to be part of the session. So I'm just going to get going into a slideshow for a minute. Now, is that showing up well for you all?
We can't actually see that. And I'm just wondering, Chris, if you and I change hosting, perhaps, can you still share screen, Alina?
Interesting. Just a minute.
If you could try again and tell me if it says you can't share.
Oh, yes. No, I'm good now. Is that good?
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. Yep, there we go. Cool. All right. So yes, thank you for having me. I'm going to speak a little bit today about the tales we tell ourselves, alternative narratives, and as Chris mentioned, 10 new myths for humanity, which I talk about in my book. But first, where I'm from in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we start conversations like this by acknowledging where we have come from. So if you'll, give me a moment to do that. Ko Makatere te Maunga, ko Waimakarere te Awa, ko Caresse, ko SS Australis aku waka, ko Witihana, ko Pākehā aku iwi, ko Siegfried taku whānau, ko Elena Siegfried aho. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi ki te mana whenua, ko Ngāti Toa, ko Taranaki Whānui, kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you all for that. So what I shared with you just now is a little bit of a nod to where I've come from, and you'll see on here there's a shrouded green mountain covered in mist, which is Makatere, my family's ancestral mountain on the Canterbury Plains in New Zealand. The braided river is the Waimakarere, beautiful river that comes down from the Southern Alps and runs right near where my mother's side of the family settled in New Zealand. And the ships being the Caresse, which her ancestors came over onto New Zealand in 1860, I believe, and the SS Australis, which my father and mother travelled on from Switzerland, where my father is from, in the late 1970s. So a little bit about where I've come from, and I also acknowledged the people of this land, the mana whenua, the Māori people, Ngāti Toa and Te Atiawa Taranaki Whānui. That's a little bit about where I'm from, and I'm loving the trend that these sorts of Indigenous practices are starting to show up more and more in these kind of conversations and infiltrating our lives a lot more. So I'd love to talk to you a little bit around why story? Why do humans respond so much to story? I've become a little bit of an amateur pop psychologist through writing this book, and I didn't really intend to do so, but it has sort of happened over the course of my storytelling career. And just to give you a little bit of an outline to what I'm going to speak to today, I'm going to speak a little bit to how story and narrative inform our lives, which I understand you've started that conversation yesterday. A little bit on some of the failed economic narratives upon which so many of our systems are still very much entrenched. An introduction to what I am calling 10 new myths for humanity, though in truth, many of them are incredibly ancient and are found in many Indigenous cultures. So while I'm introducing them as new to our current economic paradigms, they are certainly not my ideas, and they are certainly not new ideas either. And then speaking, just briefly touching on some ways of humanizing stories, so that they land heart to heart and framing for change, before diving into a spoken word performance at the end of my talk. So let's start with why story. Why do we need story to bring us into a new economic reality? And what I just often talk about here is that we as a species are very much oriented and hardwired for story. It's how we make meaning of the world. It's how we connect to one another. It makes our values tangible so that we know, what other people are about and whether or not, they are aligned with our thinking. Not that that's always necessarily the goal, is to have somebody align with our thinking, but to understand where people are coming from. Story to me very much speaks to hearts over minds. And I've heard a story referred to a few times as the operating system of the human brain, which I thought was deliciously poetic and fun. And they work very much at the implicit level. We can't necessarily say why stories are, motivate us so much, but we know that they do. We know that we are captured by them, and that we hold on to them dearly. Now, where does you want to go through? Next slide. There we go. Got a lovely quote by Maya Angelou here, which I really love, that speaks to the power of story. And that is, I've learned that people will forget what you said, they will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And that, to me, speaks to the power of a good story. There's another person I'd like to point you to, Alice Saltmarsh, who's a fantastic story specialist and narrative strategist based in the UK. And she wrote a fantastic article a number of years ago on the Stanford Social Innovation Review around using story to change systems, which you can see the URL there to the bottom. And I think we should be able to share slides as well if people want to look that up, but you should be able to Google it as well. She talks about 3 functions of story when we're having these conversations around systems change. And the first is story as light, in order to, I guess, shine a light on some of the things that have perhaps been buried by history, or the underlying dynamics that are going on, and really illuminating things that perhaps haven't been in the spotlight in the past. So stories can help us understand, those who are not like us, or those who traditionally haven't had a voice, and really shine a light on those communities and on some of the complex challenges that we're facing. The second function of story as glue, which speaks again to that binding that story can bring about when we connect with other people by means of story. And the third, which I see as an extension of that, is story as a web. So once we've done that binding and we've found communities that are resonating with the types of stories that we're telling, story itself can act as a vehicle to then connect the dots between other communities or nations, or really any group, to ensure that we are networked in the way that we're thinking about change. This is a graphic I use a fair amount in my work, and I really love it because it simplifies systems change. It's from a publication by I think it's a Boston-based consultancy called FSC Consultants. The publication it's from is well worth a read. It's called The Water of Systems Change, and talks about just as a fish doesn't know that it is in water, we ourselves really are within all of these systems that we don't even recognize often as systems that we're living within. So those top 3, policies, practices, and resource flows, they refer to as the explicit level of change, or the structural change. And these are the obvious ones that a lot of us are more familiar with when we are looking at systems change. So we look at, philanthropy and funding. We look at government policies and legislation, and certain practices within organizations, or the way that we go about things. I see this stuff as, in some ways, the low-hanging fruit of systems change, because it's the easy, obvious stuff that everybody can understand quite explicitly. And that middle level of the semi-explicit is when we get into some of the juicy stuff around power dynamics and relationships and connections between different people. Some of these very overt, and some of them much more subtle, particularly when we're talking about power dynamics and how we name those and how we talk about them. And at the bottom, this mental models of transformative change is where I really see the role of narrative playing a big role. I see, you know, our stories that we tell and our narratives very much living within those two lower levels of this inverted pyramid. And that's, you know, people's mental models about understanding the way things are, or our understanding of how the world works, I guess. And this is where I'm really interested, is in these bottom two levels, and how do we tell the stories that to date haven't been told or haven't been explicitly acknowledged. And that's where I think a lot of the narrative change work sits. Flipping that on its head now, with a more traditional pyramid, I see different layers of story in terms of, you know, how we how we engage with one another. And I mean, at the very micro level, I see this as the micro to macro of storytelling. At the micro level, you've got framing and language and the way that we talk about things every single day, which in itself can capture a whole story just in the way that we talk about things. So an example I used, excuse me a minute. An example I like to use is the term natural resources. So just in those two little words, there's a whole story wrapped up around human beings and our relationship to the natural world. And that's the assumption that the gifts of nature and the elements of these highly intricate, interconnected systems are resources that are there for the taking. They are there specifically for human use. So just even the way that we talk about things and the words that we choose to use, very powerful ways of reinforcing or challenging a story. Story, the next level down, which is, of course, you know, the ones that we are more familiar with, sometimes have a beginning, middle, end, specific characters. Narrative, as I mentioned, I see more as the unspoken stories, the meta stories that underpin our understanding of the way things are or the way the world operates. And then beneath this, which is really an area of interest for me, is myth or perhaps mythic narratives. And those are the ones where, you know, they're very, very broad concepts that are found the world over. And a note on the word myth, I've somewhat reclaimed it a little bit in my book and in this presentation, because in our modern culture, I think you'll find often the word myth has got a bit of a bad reputation. It has come to be synonymous with lies, or something that isn't true, or some theory that we believed before we knew better. And so we hear these, you know, these phrases, you know, climate change is a myth, or trickle-down economics is a myth, or the way I'm using myth is, I guess, a much more ancient concept, in terms of myth meaning a seed of human truth, I guess, that has been wrapped up in a story to make it more able to be communicated between big groups of people. And Yuval Noah Harari mentions in his book *Sapiens* around how this belief in myth and the ability to craft narratives and tell stories was pivotal in early humans, in us being able to communicate concepts and ideas beyond just our core group of people that we shared a cave with, or you know, wherever we lived. So myth, yeah, is really what I see as those very deep narratives that drive human culture. Just thought I'd touch quickly here on a few failed economic narratives. Now, I screenshotted this from some other presentation somewhere, and I can't remember where I got it, so I don't know how to reference this, but I will say that it wasn't mine to begin with. But I really liked it because it really spoke to the way that we have traditionally thought about the economy in times gone by, and in some cases we still think about the economy from Francis Bacon, we must conquer nature, and nature being a machine from Descartes, to Richard Dawkins and Adam Smith talking about selfishness and self-interest, maximizing self-interest as being the main driver of the economy. And yes, Darwin's survival of the fittest, again, it very much underpins our competitive capitalist economy, when we know now that it isn't perhaps survival of the fittest, but diversity that really drives evolution and helps systems thrive. And interesting to hear, yesterday you had a bit of a talk about reductionist science and not being able to find a good narrative to support the idea of that, which is really interesting. And yeah, well, I actually I'll wait till I talk about that in a couple of slides time, but I have some strong views about that. I did a science major at university, and so by all means I think science has given us some fantastic things, but we have certainly valued it far beyond many other ways of thinking. So I'm going to introduce now these new myths for humanity, which again I acknowledge are often quite ancient and not new concepts at all, but we do need to be reminded of them. So that's my book there that I published last year, and lovely to hear that it's been useful to be able to reference that this week, Chris. That's really nice to hear. So the first one is thinking about a wholesale move from a culture of individualism to one of collectivism. And you'll notice that all of these new myths are framed up as a current narrative that we currently have, many of them underpinning our economies, to a new myth. So moving from narrative to mythic narrative, I guess. And at the moment, we, in a lot of our Western societies still do have an incredibly individualistic view. I think in some places we're starting to get more conversations happening around collectivism, especially in jurisdictions or nations or communities where there is a stronger Indigenous presence and there is more agency. But the new myth, or the very ancient myth that I want to remind people of, is that we are all intricately intertwined with each other, and we can't see ourselves as separate. We are one species, and the health of the whole, the health of individuals is very much intertwined with the health and well-being of the whole. And from there, for me, it naturally extends that if we are all interconnected, we are, of course, very much interconnected with the world around us. And so going back to that idea of natural resources, we have this implicit narrative that drives the way that we manufacture products and services, the way that we build our houses, our cities, is that because we can take the gifts of nature and the elements of natural systems, that they're there for us to use. Whereas the new myth is that humans are nature. We don't have dominion over nature, or we don't dominate nature or have it there for us to use. But what we do to ourselves, we do to nature, because we are intricately part of that. And that's, you could look at that from a spiritual perspective, or you know, a scientific perspective as well in terms of atoms flowing between different parts of this reality that we see every single day. The third one is from sustainability to regeneration. And one of the organizations I'm working with at the moment is called Circularity, Circular Economy Consultants in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And this is the one we talk about a lot, is this idea that really in this day and age, sustainability is not enough. And even if we look at that term sustainability, it's a very old term now. The phrase, I think, sustainability and sustainable development was first used I guess, first made popular in the Brundtland Report of 1987, I believe it was, which was a few years before the Rio Earth Summit. And so that is now, we're in 1987, it is 35 years old, that term. And then if we were to look further even back, I think the earliest reference that I can find to sustainability in reference to natural ecosystems and the gifts of the earth is in Limits to Growth by Donella Meadows, who was, of course, an incredible systems thinker who used that in 1972. So depending on how you look at it, this term sustainability is between 35 and 50 years old. And a lot has changed in that time. So I think the new narrative that we need to be talking about is that sustainability isn't enough. We actually have a duty to repair and regenerate the harm that we have already caused. And not just to ecological systems, but to social and cultural systems as well. From stuff to enough. Those old Black Friday sales. Yeah, every time that time of year comes around, I get a little bit anxious about the ads that are going to pop up on my feed, and I don't know about how it is in Australia, but it's really starting to pop up around here in New Zealand. And we don't even have Thanksgiving as a holiday, you know, let alone like we need a Black Friday. It's crazy. But it is, of course, grounded in that old narrative that buying and owning lots of stuff is the way to happiness and success. And that, of course, is a narrative that is driven constantly by the advertising industry, who relies very much on selling products. And of course, our current economic system, with its focus on more and more growth, is quite reliant upon this narrative. You know, if we believe the new myth that the key to happiness is being content with having enough, you know, once you've got a roof over your head, and everything that you need, and good people around you, and you know, heaven forbid you might stop buying stuff, and the economy as we know it would collapse. So this is an interesting one, and there's some interesting research that they've done, I think, in the United States around where happiness levels peak in terms of they correlated it with income. And I think they found it about an annual household income of $105,000 per year is when happiness peaks and then plateaus and then actually often starts to drop off. So that's really interesting in terms of thinking about how much money do you need to actually, you know, be satisfied with where your life is and be happy. From scarcity to abundance. And of course, this current narrative of scarcity is integral to our current economic system. It's what drives market prices. It's what drives trade and whether products get moved or shipped or not. And and this idea that there isn't enough to go around, so we have to put, you know, a fair price on things. And this one's interesting because, you know, we often hear, you know, offhand comments from the media or whoever it might be around these notions of scarcity. And, you know, one that we often hear is that we're going to need, you know, I think, I forget the exact figure, but 10 times more food in the next 40 years than we are currently producing to feed the world. And often with not a mention of the fact that roughly 1/3 of the food that we currently produce goes to waste for various reasons, whether it's that the price isn't right, so it can't be sold or moved on, or the geopolitical system means that the food doesn't get to where it needs to be. And so I guess the myth that I'm advocating for is that with the right systems in place, in an economic system that supports the notion and is built on the notion that that everybody should be able to access basic human needs, food, shelter, water, that our lives can in fact be full of abundance. And that's of course tied in with the last concept as well. I'm just going to help myself to a cough lolly here. I have got a little bit of a tickle going on and I don't want to have a coughing fit. So the next myth is, yeah, from competition to collaboration. And again, it's a big one underpinning our global economy. This idea that competition is the best way to drive innovation and solve problems and meet our needs. And of course, you know, that might sometimes be good for consumers in terms of getting a lower price on products. But I think, as many of us have become aware of, it's the cost of those products is often externalized as hidden costs when it comes to labor, when it comes to environmental degradation, or walking upon somebody else in order to be able to deliver those low costs. And I think with the magnitude of the problems that the world is facing today around climate change and ecological collapse and the acidification of the oceans, and social issues also around inequality and poverty and systemic racism, I think we need to recognise that competition isn't necessarily going to be the best way that we solve these problems going forward. And that we actually need to be working together a lot more than we do. And, you know, a lot of these problems, the urgency of them requires us to collaborate at a rate much faster than any of us have ever been used to. In saying that, off the back of talking about the urgency of problems, I also want to presence that urgency and a relentless drive for productivity has overtaken many of our lives, particularly in Western cultures, in that we see constantly being busy and being more productive in an economic sense is the best way to go about our lives. And of course, that's intertwined with accumulating a lot of money to buy a lot of stuff. But recognizing that, I think, particularly in this, you know, there was a phrase I heard recently, this VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and I forget what the A is for. But But many of us are finding that we do need to be quite explicit about taking that downtime, about taking that time to stand back and reflect, and that there are times for doing things and there are times for not doing things and for just reflecting. And this is certainly one that I struggle with in my own life, and I think many of you might also struggle with that challenge, but that I'm getting better at. And I think in some regards, I think all of humanity needs to take a little bit of a pause and think about what is it that actually needs to happen from here on in. From west to the rest, so acknowledging here that our current narratives tells us that Western civilized, and I want to put those in inverted commas for sure, Western civilized thought is superior to other primitive belief systems. And that is evident in our economic policy, in our ways that we organize our cities and the way that we live, right down to this idea of nuclear families being the best way to organize our home lives. And then moving to this myth and recognition that there are many legitimate ways of knowing and of feeling and sensing and intuiting that we don't perhaps objectively value in our current economic paradigm, but I think perhaps more important right now than ever for us to be able to acknowledge and embrace. Now, this is a bit of an elephant in the room for all I've talked about so far, is that these kind of systemic changes that I'm talking about are not going to be possible if it falls only upon the shoulders of women to be driving these changes, or other gender minorities. So very much, a lot of our economies, a lot of our social systems, a lot of the ways that we organize our businesses and governance boards is based on very patriarchal narratives around the best way to get things done, and that patriarchal social and political structures are the best way and the most efficient way. Whereas I think the new narrative there, or the new myth, is around the gifts and approaches of all genders holding value, and that we cannot solve these problems if we're excluding more than half of the world at this decision-making table. And finally, the last myth is from now to forevermore, or one that really tries to highlight the idea of long-term thinking, the very long-term thinking. The current narrative that we have, from advertising slogans, just do it, right through to the way that we organize our businesses in terms of quarterly reports and 3-year plans and so on, is very short. Our elections cycles that are about 3 years apart. Whereas the new myth, again ancient, is that we are just a tiny, tiny speck in the history of humankind. There are many generations to come. There are many generations who have been, who we can learn from, but there are also many to come. And there's a fantastic app that I would suggest people download. It seems funny to tell people to download an app when I'm talking about these very long time frames, but it's called the Deep Time Walk, and it is a 4.6 kilometer narrated journey, and you actually play it on your phone with your headphones as you go for a 4.6 kilometer walk. And I guess the GPS measures where you are, and every 100 meters you walk represents 100 million years of the Earth's history at 4.6 billion years. And so you walk and walk and walk, and nothing happens for a very, very long time. You've got microbes in the ocean, and finally, very, very near the end, you see plant life arrive and dinosaurs. And then it's not until the last 20 centimeters of the walk, so that's 20 centimeters out of 4.6 kilometers, that human beings even enter the picture on the Earth. which is a profound thing to realize. And then if you think of the period of time perhaps that is recognized as the Anthropocene or the Industrial Age, since we really started having a significant impact on the planet, let's say that's 250 years. The length of that is about the span of a dust mite. So from 4.6 kilometers, it's taken us the length of a dust mite to really royally mess up this planet. So it really puts things into perspective in terms of thinking about, how long we've been here, how long the Earth potentially could be here from now onwards, and what kind of legacy we want to leave. I just want to briefly touch on going back to stories and having these conversations of systems change the way that we tell those stories. And this represents a big part of my work, is no matter what story I'm telling, I'm really interested in finding the human in that story, because whether you're telling the story of a policy or a technological product or a service or a system, there are always people involved. And so finding that common humanity and being able to share and present the aligned values is really important. Speaking just briefly to this hero's journey narrative, which I talk about a fair amount in the book, and I have quite mixed feelings around the hero's journey narrative. I think a way that I can reconcile some of my hesitations around this narrative of somebody going on a journey and transforming themselves and coming back and never being the same again, is to recognize that we all live within a system, and heroes need sidekicks. And the sidekick that might be a hero in a different story, and that there really often, when we're talking about systemic challenges, is no villain. And laying blame is not a helpful way to move forward. So I think I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide, but rather than having stories of change be about an individual person or one particular lens on this one life or experience, rather we're looking at developing the stories of individual organizations, nations, any organizing system for humans as an interconnected web of life. And just got the old Marvel examples here, and I don't love superhero flicks, but what I do love about the Marvel Cinematic Universe and DC is that there really is an interconnected story that just brings in all of these different characters, and we do see things like Iron Man there as the hero of his particular movie, but in Civil War he's cast as a villain, and others suggesting that Thanos there on the far left is actually the unsung hero of the Thor movies. And so I think there's a lot of nuance and complexity here that I really love. And finally, a little bit on framing, going back to that micro story conversation, and I'm just having a look at the time. I've gone over my time, haven't I? Okay.
Yeah, we're running a bit short, so if we could wrap up fairly quickly.
I might just skip this slide, and do we still have time to do the spoken word?
Yeah, I think it's pretty short.
Okay. It's about 4 minutes, 5 minutes. But I'll kick into it. And apologies for going over time. This poem is about overcoming polarization, I guess. And I think rather than explain, I'm just going to start. If we are to believe the stories that dominate our social media feed, there are an evil group of people out there who are out to destroy our lives. They do not share our values. They have no common sense. They will take away your freedom, bombard you with fake news, brainwashing your children with their propaganda. They will do everything in their power to take away all that you hold sacred. Beware, they are out there, the people we call them, the enemy, them, those other ones, them, the ones we must overcome, the target of every comment section everywhere. So desperate are we to know that we are the, sorry, I'm just going to have to, I haven't done this one for a while, so I have to bring up my, my notes. So confident are we that we are the ones who are right. We have turned respectful public debate into millions of miniature individual dictatorships of the mind. The teeth of our savage soundbites grow ever sharper by the day, while indignant ears grow deaf to anything that does not reinforce our worldview. There is no room for reason in a lynch mob. No longer a gift and give and take. No space for context and complexity in a 280-character tweet. The air is growing thin in this here echo chamber. It's getting harder and harder to breathe. We need not even look too far before we can identify them. Even amongst brothers and sisters in arms, sibling rivalry cuts deep. The climate activist questions the urgency of queer rights if we have no habitable planet to call our home. The unionist challenges foreign aid when a working wage can't even feed our own people. We hear it's the immigrants who are the problem, or those people in SUVs. No, it's the dairy farmers, the greenies, the feminists, the TERFs, the bankers, the church, the NRA. It's corporate welfare, guerrilla warfare, it's the liberal media, the gay agenda, it's them, it's they, it's only those people. If only they would stop. Listen. Can you hear that? That is the sound of singular stories. It is the sound of petty distractions. It is the sound of red herrings gasping for breath as the future slips away. Oblivious to our own hypocrisy and wasting our precious energy, we are setting ourselves on fire in the hopes that they will die of smoke inhalation. It need not be this way. We can be better than this. We have the cure for them. It's simple. It is us. What if we took our pointing fingers and we turned them upside down to extend the gentle hand of compromise? Offered up our gifts and contributions with open hearts, embracing grace and humility. That's not to say that we should deny the role of privilege, ignore the wounds from the past, or cease to pursue our passion for change. After all, even the Buddha taught non-violence, not pacifism. But let us dismantle systems of oppression without creating carbon copies addressed to them. Step away from the militancy you have held so close as a lover. Soften your heart and walk a mile in shoes that do not fit, shoes that cause you discomfort. Blisters edging their way in beneath the soles of the feet you have so firmly planted into the arguments you've convinced yourself are solid. This place is familiar. It is comfortable, but we desperately need to stand upon common ground. For it is there that we can pinpoint the underlying causes behind our addiction to outrage. Feelings of grief, of losing that which we hold dear. Feelings of fear, of those who we do not understand. Feelings of pain, of leaning into the despair of not knowing how the hell we are going to dig ourselves out of this mess. Respect the collective wisdom that comes from listening to many voices that are different from your own. Find your passion and then you do you and do it well, while simultaneously seeking to understand why it is that they care so much about something else. According to particle physics, we exchange 98% of the atoms in our bodies with the world around us every year. So I am you, and you are me, and they are us, and we are them. We are them. We are them. To somebody, somewhere, you are them. Kia ora, thank you.
Glorious. Thank you so much, Alina. I really love that. And there was a lot of comments in the chat that were feeling the same way. So
thank you so much. Yeah, and apologies again for going over time.
That's all right, but I think it does mean we'll have to hold the questions to try and give Caresse and Sophia as much time as possible. Wicked Elephants team, you've got a bit less time than we anticipated, but I'm hoping we might be able to convince some people to stay a little bit beyond the time at the end if they're keen, because we'd love to get into this activity. So many thanks, Alina. I'm going to take us straight into the activity from Wicked Elephants, which I will very briefly introduce Caresse Cranwell and Sophia Van Ruth from Wicked Elephants. Caresse is a long-time facilitator of both personal and social change workshops. She's an experiential psychotherapist focused on the inner journey and deep ecology, and another spoken word artist. We've got plenty of them here today, it seems. And Sophia offers highly interactive workshops and trainings using play-based, arts-based and meditative methodologies to support people in gaining deeper insights into complex problems within their lives or work. And I know Wicked Elephants is working with NENA on some work around polarities as well, which has come up today and yesterday. So I think really happy to have you here, Caresse and Sophia, and I'll hand straight over to you.
Thank you, Chris. So I'm going to kick us off today. And we're going to, I liked what Alina said about finding the human in every story. And I hope that we're going to tap into some of the humanity in some of your stories in this session. So it's thank you, Alina. It's great to lead on from you. So I'm not going to talk too much. I'd like to lead you into a participatory exercise. Caresse is going to talk a little bit more afterwards and maybe frame it a little bit with some theory. But I'm going to jump pretty much straight in. What we do a lot, well, what I do a lot is try and give people embodied experiences to help them tap into some of their unconscious wisdom. So the first thing that I want to do is just invite you to turn your camera off and mute yourself. You don't need to be witnessed in this. All you need to do is to be able to hear me. So you don't have to stay sitting in front of the computer either, if you don't want to. So I'm going to invite you to do some movement. I'm going to lead it as in moving your hand and arm, and I'll keep myself, hang on, I'll just spotlight myself so I'm a little bit bigger. So if you think, what's she talking about? You can always have a look at what I'm doing as I'm leading you. So, hang on, I've lost my thread. So find a space where you can move freely. If you want to move more of your body, you can. If you want to move less of your body, you can. If you're in a space where you think, oh, I don't really want to do this, there's someone over there that I don't want to witness this, you can make very small movements, or you can even imagine moving. That can work for you too. So take this at your own pace and your own level. So find your space where you're standing, sitting. You can even lie down to do this hand movement. And just start by moving a hand and arm. And if you want to move your whole body, just translate when I say hand and arm to body. So move your hand and arm using smooth and fluid movements to start with. Just moving around, exploring how far you can go in different directions. And then start moving a little bit faster. And switch from that to jerky movements. This is part of just really getting into your body here, playing around with different ways of moving. And then bring your hand in contact with a part of your body. And just pause there for a moment. Notice how that feels. Bring your hand in contact with a different part of your body. And again, just pause for a moment. Notice how that connection there feels. And then start moving again, but this time very slowly. Making some very slow movements. And freeze. Notice the shape your hand and arm is making. Make a different shape. Hold that shape for a moment. Notice how that shape feels for you. And make one more shape. Again, just notice how that shape feels. And then let that shape go by shaking your hand. Shake it out in a few different directions. And then come to a neutral position. And just breathe there for a moment. Let that settle. I'm going to invite you to think of a moment in your own life, a moment in your life that you realized that you wanted the economy to be different. It might be the moment for you that you realized you wanted the economy to be different, or it might just be one moment of many. But see if you can find a moment where you realized that you wanted the economy to be different. And take some time to recall, where were you? What was happening? Who was there? Transporting yourself back to that moment. And as you're transporting yourself back to that moment, you might notice, along with memories emerging, that some feelings start to emerge. See if you can connect with those. What was it like to be there? What feelings did you experience? And maybe as you're reliving those feelings, you notice some physical sensations in your body. Just check in with your own body. How is it responding as you reconnect with this experience? Maybe you feel tension in some areas. Maybe you feel some tinglings. Any sensations? So now I'm going to invite you to allow your body to move a little bit in response to this experience. So as these memories and feelings are arising, you can allow your arm and hand to move in response. And these movements don't have to make sense. Approach this with a sense of curiosity. How does my body seem to want to respond to this? And you can play with this. So you have full permission to be playful and not make sense. So I'm going to give you a minute or two to play with this for yourselves. Just allowing the different feelings or memories arising to be in your movement. It's absolutely impossible to do this wrong. Now I'm going to invite you to just focus in on what were you longing for in that moment? What was the longing that you experienced? See if you can let your body express it first. Just move without thinking too much. And shifting your focus now to where has this experience led you since? What did it trigger in you? Did it change you? Have you acted on this longing? And again, trying to let your body express it first, having that sense of curiosity about how your body wants to respond. Impossible to do this wrong. And then finding an ending. So finding a comfortable kind of ending shape that you can hold for a moment. And just breathing there. Notice how that shape you're making with your body or your hand makes you feel. And just take a moment to just let that experience settle. And then when you're ready, you can just come back to the screen, switch your cameras on again if you wish to switch your camera on. So I'm going to hand us over to Caresse now to lead the next section.
Thank you, Sophia. Why we do that is that we really believe that our stories live in our bodies, that the stories that connect are stories that resonate and touch our feelings, touch our feeling self. They not necessarily, they can engage our minds, but if we operate from our left and tell stories from our left brain, from the discriminating rational mind, it'll often precipitate debate, difference, opposition. So the stories that we're really inviting you to connect to are the stories that live in you, live in grief in you, live and that sing in you. And we believe that, you know, as part of our belief and part of our practice is to bring the personal narrative into the collective narrative. How do we build the bridges between us together so we're not talking to them, not blaming them, but how do we build the connective tissue between us in our culture that invites curiosity, that invites deeper relationship, that invites us to weave a new ecology of relationship. So what we want to do is actually get you to tell your stories. We're going to use a story stem to do that. I'm going to just drop the story stem into the chat. It's very simple story stem. And we at Wicked Elephants, we really love things to be participatory because we believe that we learn from one another. So this story stem, we're just going to get you to sort of reflect and write your story very quickly, jump into breakout rooms very quickly because we're running out of time, and share with one another and feel the impact of sharing those stories. So I'm going to demonstrate the story stem and how it works just by telling you a little bit of one of my stories. So we use the sentence starters, once upon a time, and then I speak about that, and then every day until one day something happened because of that, because of that, because of that, until finally, and ever since then. So I'll demonstrate my story that I've written, and then I am going to invite us just to spend a few minutes using the story stem to write your story. So once upon a time, I met an international community of really powerful women who are interested in social justice. And every day I simply went to work, and I was part of a young adult community who were really educating ourselves around issues of justice. And we weren't really living it, we were doing it in our mind. Until one day, I went to the Philippines, and there I was invited into the shelters of people's whose homes, well, they weren't homes, they were shelters erected on rubbish dumps, who made their homes out of what they collected, who lived their lives and earned their living through what they collected. They slept side by side, sitting up, huddled on this thin wooden plank. I also had the opportunity to go into a free trade zone. And in that zone, there were a lot of Australian companies operating. And I got to meet the people working in those factories. And I was exposed to their poverty. I was exposed to their griefs for the high rates of mortality. I was exposed to the grief of their dispossession from their land, and it really made me feel the powerful injustice of that inequality just by virtue of my birth. Because of that, I began to question my consumption habits. I began to look at where things came from. Because of that, I began to question international trade, the things that were hidden, the things that the hidden costs and the things that we just throw away. And I in every place I've lived, I've grown some small garden just to make a gesture of growing my own food, eating locally, buying locally. Until one day I got an opportunity to make a short film with a dear friend of mine, Kate, who is a sustainable cloth maker. And she reuses, repurposes, dyes, restitches, creates garments that help us to rethink about the way in which fashion can be more sustainable or regenerative even. And that got to play on ABC News 24 at least 3 times. I was elated. And ever since I've tried to tell stories that create bridges. I've tried to tell stories not from the point of view of my self-righteousness, but from the place of my pain and my vulnerability. It builds connection. That's my story. So now I invite you to just spend a couple of minutes just writing down your story using that story stem. And we may put you into breakout rooms before you're fully prepared, but just go with it, you know, just make it up as you go, because we really want to give each one of us the opportunity of sharing something of our story and practicing this way of telling a narrative. So I'll give you just a couple of minutes. I'll be quiet and invite you just to use the story stem that's there in the chat. So the story stem is simply once upon a time and every day until one day. Because of that, until finally, and ever since that day. And it's great if your story relates to the economy, and maybe another story will occur to you later on, and we'll give you a place where you can share those stories together. So now we're going to just put you into breakout rooms. I don't think we have 7 minutes, Sophia. So can we just do 5 minutes?
What if I do it without any minutes and we can just...
All right. Okay. All right. So we're going to just invite you into breakout rooms just for 5 minutes or however long we've got. And we want you just to have an opportunity, just briefly share your story with that stem. It'd be great. Thanks. Off you go.
Can I just check, Sophia, you've got access to the breakout rooms? You're okay?
Yep.
Good.
All good. I think I've got it all ready to go. Hang on, there's a couple of people who've shifted since I started. So there's a couple of rooms with only one person. I'm just going to combine them. Ugh, it keeps popping up where I can't see what I'm doing. Okay, I'll try now.
I didn't seem to get an invitation, maybe because I'm host.
Pardon me. Say
Anywhere you
again.
want me to go?
Oh,
Say
maybe
again, Chris.
because you're host. Oh, she's gone.
So we have another couple of people in the main room with us. So let's
I've got
just.
one room with, oh, damn it, I've got one room with 3. I wonder why. So we're the only ones in here now, are we? I wonder why
There
it
are
took so long.
2 others there, but they may have not accepted the invitation.
Right.
Yeah.
And I can see that there's one room with 3 people in it, but I think I'll just leave them.
Yeah, just leave it. Yeah.
Well, no, I do have one room with 1.
Yeah. Okay. No worries.
No
No worries, James. Fine. All good. Yeah, so I think we will drop the document link.
Yep.
Yeah. Shall I grab that or do you want to?
Okay, do you want to grab that?
Okay. Can you give people just a changeover? Tell them to change over.
Okay. I presume the person with 1 person in their room's just doing their own thing. They haven't come back here
Okay.
or raised their hand, and I don't know what else to do with them. I don't want to move the 3 now.
Have they raised their hand?
No, not that I can see.
All right. Well,
I guess they're just sorting it out themselves.
yeah.
Okay, broadcast message, swap.
Swap and just another.
Swap over if you haven't already.
And how long have you got it set for? 30 seconds, a minute? When?
Oh, I don't know. I didn't check that.
It's possibly a minute. So
probably a minute.
Yeah. So we'll just give it another minute and then hit that button.
Oh, well, that was a bit, it's funny how the breakout rooms didn't seem to go very well either. I think a lot of people were leaving the event as well after I'd set them up, so they kept dropping.
Right. Yeah.
People decided to go at that moment. So I had to keep kind of adjusting.
Yes. Yeah.
Anyway.
I
think it went pretty well considering the time constraints. We lost 15 minutes of a 45-minute session nearly.
Yeah. Probably shouldn't talk too much.
Oh, okay. Oh, you think there's still people in this main room with us?
Yeah, there are.
Ah, okay. Sorry, I didn't notice that.
It's okay. So maybe hit the return and then they'll get their 60-second warning so they can finish up.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, they did get a 60-second warning.
Yeah, great. So we'll ask them to drop the stories and we'll just tell them about our Wicked Story for Changemaker event.
Yeah, sure.
Mm.
Did you already put the link to the document in the?
No, I won't, because everybody needs to come back up, come back in before we post that, or they'll miss it.
Okay.
Mm.
"15 seconds.
All magically appear. See how many are left.
3, 2, 1.
So how was that, people? Just put a few comments in the chat room. We know it was very short, compressed time. So just give us a few. Was that great to share other people's stories? Whatever you experienced, it'd be lovely to hear in the chat. And we have created a document for people to share their stories with one another. We would have loved to have had you share your stories here in the main room, and maybe there can be another forum for actually sharing of stories that would really help us really mine our personal narrative. So I'm going to just put the link in the chat, and I invite you to write your story into this document. So you can open it now, you can write it whenever you like, but it would be really fabulous for NENA to capture a little bit of this material and to be inspired by one another, the sharing of one another's stories.
I'll just note quickly, Caresse, that this is the document we used in yesterday's session as well. So scroll down to the end and you'll see the new bit for today's session.
Thank you very much, Chris. Wicked Elephants is also creating an event later in the year called Wicked Stories for Changemakers. And we would love for you to come and join us in creating and sharing some wicked stories. So to keep informed about that, just go to our website, which is there, wickedelephants.coop. And if you signed up to our newsletter, you just get some notification, but we will put it on the NENA Facebook page as well. So at 1:31, we are going to close and hand back to you, Chris, and hope that we can put our stories at the service and our vulnerability at the service of one another and of life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caresse and Sophia. And it was excellent experience to try and put stories into that story stem structure. And my apologies for the timing. It was really my fault that I forgot we'd need some time at the start and didn't allow for all of that. So I'm sorry that affected the session. Thanks to everyone who's stuck with us. I did want to have a quick plug for tomorrow's session, which is NENA's version of the Gruen transfer. So we're going to take some little videos, short videos, which express narratives in particular ways, old narratives, new narratives, and we're going to pick them apart in true Gruen style. But we'll also have Eleanor Glenn from Common Cause Australia, who's going to lead us off in that session, and she's going to give us some tools for thinking about values and frames and how we see those in narratives so that we can all do this picking apart together. So while we'll have a panel, we'll try and make it a bit fun like the Gruen transfer show for those who've seen it. There's also an opportunity for you to learn some tools that you can use to notice narratives, because as we've heard in several of the sessions so far, we're often swimming in those narratives. They're the water that we don't see around us. So these tools can help us to start to see how we might be influenced by those communications that are around us. So huge thanks to Alina for her wonderful presentation and poem, and to Caresse and Sophia for their compressed version of the workshop there. Please do add your stories into the document. We'd love to see them. Michelle, anything you wanted to add before we close?
No, I just wanted to also thank you, everyone, and thanks, Chris, for holding together. And please don't worry about the time. We apologise if we didn't quite get it right, but I think this workshop still felt really excellent with some shared information and some actual activities and things to do. But do join us tomorrow. We're very much looking forward to picking apart some of these other stories and other ideas. And if you're
in a nice way, of course.
Oh, in a nice way, of course. We're always nice in NENA, and for nice. No, it's just a way to show us that sort of not to be binary, but how some stories reflect some core values and how they're structured, and how other stories are trying to reach for a new way of sharing ideas. But the only other thing is to give a plug for the other sessions through the week. Please, if you're not familiar with what the program's all about, have a look on our website. If you go to neweconomy.org.au, there's a little button on the homepage that takes you straight to NENA Narratives, and you'll see the image behind me too if you pop back onto the humanities space. So thank you, Chris, and thank you, Sophia, Caresse, and Alina. Really been wonderful. I've enjoyed it. I've learned many good things.
Great.
And hopefully we'll see you all tomorrow.
Yeah. And we'll close it there. Thanks everyone for bearing with us with the timing, and hopefully we'll see you next time.
Yeah.
Bye now.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.